Okay, here we are at the Battle of Lobositz. This is my first foray into the Clash of Arms battles of the Age of Reason series. My first impression on this is, well, first of all, the map is a work of art. There's no question there. It's wonderfully textured, but this is something I remembered about Clash of Arms games all the way back. They all had this texture, but it pooches kind of annoyingly. Still, there's something very nice there. Counters, I've got more question about these because they're not terribly functional in my view. There's some serious problems with them. Let me see if I can switch hands, because unfortunately I'm not AMB. Oh, I can show you one of these. So, you got some information on the counters, and here's a leader. Now, I think that's his command range and his movement allowance there. Seems all simple, except his key values here, his initiative value, his combat advantage, I don't know what that 4 is. Effectiveness bonus, that's a bonus he gives to effectiveness die rolls for morale, formation, other such things. Okay, and I'll go into the rules a little bit because I need a reminder too. I fought my way through them a couple of times already. Units, likewise, they have a strength and a movement allowance listed on them, but then on the back they've got other key values. This is just indicated it's routed, but this is their close combat bonus, and this is their effectiveness base die roll. The amount they have to roll to get on roll above in order to pass an effectiveness check. There are always modifiers to this, usually. It uses percentile dice for most operations. Sometimes it uses a straight 10-sider. With the percentile dice, you have a tendency to be rolling and performing more cognitive actions to figure out what you've got. Along with all the addition of modifiers, etc., there's a lot of little nitpicky stuff going on in your head with every action that takes place in this game. That can even include movement, because if you move through iffy terrain with a counter, at the end of its movement it makes an effectiveness check to see if it ends up being disordered. Okay, let's go to the rulebook. Well, it's not terribly poorly written. It seems it's just overwhelming. It's actually fairly tight and dense for what it's accomplishing. I mean, in 23 pages, not tiny print like in Task Force games, it ends up covering what is probably one of the most complicated tactical games systems that I've seen. Complicated in the sense, not that there are these really, really tough concepts, but just lots of little pieces. Basically, the design concept for this system has been, let's make everything that we can possibly think of go into the game in a somewhat intuitive manner, in the sense that it makes sense. You immediately look at it and say, yeah, that's realistic, but not intuitive in the sense that it's going to stick in your mind easily. It's going to take a lot of playing to get used to this system to where, it doesn't take me 20 minutes to move a unit, I think. We'll see. But that's my fear with it, and that's why I've been kind of evading playing these, is because I think they're going to be tremendously... Whoa. Oh wow, I have Brandywine in Germantown too now. Stupid me. Okay, so I'm going to be stuck playing a number of these in a row, probably, maybe with things in between. Okay, Here's the sequence of play. Doesn't look too terrible. It fits on a page at least, right? Every hour, you count the total loss of strength points. Now, there are two ways to track strength points. One of them is using counters underneath units, as many tactical games do. The other, and probably better, is to use these roster sheets. Unfortunately, they only provide you with one of each nation, so I either have to redraw this. I don't have a plastic sheet to slip it into. I don't think I do here. And these are probably, like in the CWB series, advantageous to tracking things, because you do need to be able to count the total number of losses on every hour, and that's going to be a bitch if the counters are all over the board. And then you compare it, your total losses. The first time you hit a column, you start rolling on that column with 1 10-sider, and that becomes a penalty to your effectiveness rating for all your units if you end up getting it. Once you've rolled once on a column, you don't roll on it again. You wait until you hit the next loss number. You don't roll on columns you skipped over, so if I went from 100 to 200 immediately, I wouldn't have to roll on the 150 table. On the 200 table, well, on the final table at the back of the at the end of your morale or whatever, you have to roll on that on every hour from then on. Once you reach that, that is really the breaking point for your army, and you will eventually just collapse once you reach that point, unless you can collapse the enemy first. That's a nice. I like the mechanism. I definitely do. Nothing doesn't sound too complicated, except for having to keep track of all the strength points without a little death track. You know, there's a lot of component choices that have been put into play in earlier systems that weren't made in this, like giving, a little track to keep track of death. But the paper will work. Okay. On each turn, it works as follows. Each player rolls a 10-sider for initiative. They add modifiers based on their overall commander's initiative. Now, some of this could have been spent in the preceding step to reduce the chance of your army degrading. Basically, you can spend command initiative for that hour, and then you will be less likely to be initiative. If you win the initiative, and if only one player rolls as their other, sort of the special initiative table, which is cool. It's per battle, and it allows events that, happened in the battle, or could have happened in the battle, to be incorporated in the game as random events, right in with the mechanism without having to add something new. Sort of. So, whoever wins the initiative gets to decide who has to move a command next. They can either take it or they can hand it to someone else. If they win by twice the opponent's value or more, they can declare they're moving a whole wing. And a wing that hasn't been activated yet, you can only allocate unactivated units for the most part. A wing that hasn't been activated yet can be activated as a whole, or the parts of it that haven't been activated, as long as the wing leader hasn't been activated yet. Okay. So whoever goes then has the meat of an activity. And the first thing they do is they trace lines of command. And it has to make it back to their army leader, except in the condition that they've detached a unit. You can detach a wing, essentially a wing. But of course, like everything else, it allows you a little bit more flexibility than that, causing the rules to have lots of little complications. Okay. Once you determine who's in command, You can check, basically, if you're stacked with the commander, it's automatic, but otherwise, you can make effectiveness rolls on any disordered units to see if they undisorder. Then you get to do sort of a pre-fire segment. This is pretty common to tactical games of a certain nature. In a lot of ways, this strikes me as trying to simulate a miniatures game more than trying to take advantage of the hex grid completely. Basically, I feel like the designers have said, ooh, a hex grid, that's kind of nice because it allows me to put things on paper and make them cheaper, and you don't have to be a minis advocate fanatic to play this. You don't have to spend hours and hours painting your minis. Problem is this. Hex maps have serious the abstraction has a serious effect, and they're trying to mitigate that effect and make this much, much closer to a minis game. And that makes a very complicated rule set. More complicated, I think, than most minis games have, to try and compensate for dealing with the hex grid within the game. Movement, for example, the oblique movement means sliding from one to another as you move. And just to make it more complicated, some units face hex points, some face hex sides. It depends on your formation. So for example, most of the formations allow you to face the hex point. Certainly the fighting ones do. But here we've got artillery and road column, and they're facing the hex side so that they can follow the grain of the hex on the road. Most games abstract that out a little bit better, or a little bit more, and say, look, we'll take a little hit on realism. All right. So you're allowed to pre-fire, and I don't want to explain everything in the game. I certainly am incapable of it. But you have these nice little player aid charts that contain all the information you need, sort of. Problem is, it takes some effort to figure out just what they mean, because the rules are very dense, and you have to... I actually had to cut down and look at the examples in the back of the book, which I usually do not have to do with well-written rules. But these aren't that bad. Okay. So, fire multiple modifiers. This ends up affecting every unit. If I can find it. I don't know if it's on these charts. It may be on others. There's like multiple sets of charts. But somewhere there's a set of charts that gives the multipliers for the different, for the different nationalities, for the different formations, for the different types of units. All a mess. I mean, you're going to have to, oh, here it is, fire combat multipliers. So, for the most part, like Grenadiers will always be ×5, unless they're at 2 hex range, in line or hook. Now, this is what's not clear to me. My immediate thought is, oh, skirmishers are bonused, except for one thing. And these are per game rules chart sets. Grenzers are always in skirmish formation in this one. And they have this same 2 hex in line or column. So my feeling is that same penalty applies to skirmishers, to skirmish formation as well. They just didn't state it as explicitly. And that actually makes sense. So anyway, for infantry it's pretty easy. For artillery, you have to combine the weight of the gun along with its range. And the bracketed numbers are if there's poor visibility. Fog, or I think there's dusk turns in this one too. Okay. You end up adding up all the people who are firing at something, and then you compare it to the terrain value of all things. Every terrain has its own fire defense value. It's kind of a neat way of handling terrain bonuses. Again, feels very much like those ultra detailed minis games that I've seen. Nice system. It's just you're looking up so many things on every action and then making a die roll. You roll percentile dice. On a 0 through 9 natural roll, you get a special result, and that's pretty common throughout the game to get special results for things. And then you get a result along the column here, casualty numbers. R/D is a special result. What it means is if you're just doing your offensive fire combat on your turn, it allows the defender to shoot back. If it's done during opportunity or defensive fire, the target makes a disorder check on that. You have a chance of, shattering advancing enemies. Okay, let's keep going. And yes, this is a very heavy rule set. I am going to try to explain and give a fairly good feel for it. Mainly for myself. Movement segment. Yeah. Okay, movement is really, really painful in this game. Because again, they're trying to hit this ultimate in realism within a hex grid. And it's a tough feeling. So formations, for example. Here's the formation change charts. Because units, and we've seen line extensions in other games, but units can spread out over 5-6 hexes in this. And there aren't enough counters to completely fill that in very easily. There are very, very few of these line extensions. So if that's going to be a common occurrence, and I don't think it will, it seems disadvantageous to me to spread out that much. The only thing that can really do it in line formation is the cavalry. Infantry is usually 2 hexes. There still seem to be too few counters for that, though. Okay. Movement's conducted kind of strangely because, for example, in a column or something, you don't just pay the lead unit and have everything else trail behind, which is usually what games tend to do. Instead, the decision here is, hey, the lead unit's not going to go running ahead. The lead of a unit is not going to go running ahead if there's rough terrain behind. They try to keep the formation together, so you have to pay a cost for every unit that passes over the most expensive terrain. Again, an attempt at being a little bit more realistic. Okay. There are limited activations. Oh, I forgot to explain a couple of things. Limited activations. A turn ends as players are rolling off their initiatives. The turn end is kind of variable. Once you hit the turn end point, limited activations are allowed, which are basically column movement on the road or whatever. What that means is that, hey, just because you didn't roll your dice, the units that are marching still get to keep marching. The battlefield, there might be rest going on, but it's probably unlikely that units that are hurrying towards battle are just going to sit down and stop for a turn. And again, a nice feature, but a little bit more complexity. Okay. Movement segment. Yeah. Close combat segment. Okay. Here, if you're adjacent to someone, you can make a close combat. They get a defensive fire in that case. And nothing too exciting about this. There's range charges, kind of like in the Ney versus Wellington, or I guess Wellington's victory games, which makes sense. Cavalry have to have an influence range. You'll see the same in the Napoleonic Brigade series. And then finally, you're going to go to a rally phase, and the units that have finished get marked as unfinished, and Then you make morale checks on units that are in poor morale. And again, this is an effectiveness roll. If you succeed, their morale increases. If they're routing, they keep routing, as in many games. Okay. That went by quicker than I expected. Let's go to this particular scenario and what's kind of interesting here. So this is the first battle of the 7 Years' War of any size. And Frederick has the Saxons bottled up, and the Austrians are trying to make... they're trying to pin this force briefly so that they can make this rescue attempt for the Saxons and get their army incorporated into their own army. The battle, Frederick is marching between two hills. This is one really interesting thing. The game map uses contour lines. This is, I think, going to be really, really difficult to cope with in terms of grabbing information off the map easily. But it does make the map fairly pretty. Frederick is going to march between these two big hills, and there's also some villages which are kind of impediments to moving as well if they want to move through them. And comes forward, and he thinks he's not facing the entire Austrian army. In fact, he thinks he's facing a rear guard. The rest of the Austrian army is going to be off map. I haven't built this yet, but basically... Not that chart. I don't know. There's a... Shit. Brilliant. Okay, there's a chart somewhere or another in this pile that covers... Yeah, here. These are off-map hexes, and basically these guys are set up in them. Can move around. They're not really visible to Frederick at the beginning of the game. As visibility improves, they get better. What the hell? Sure. Alright. So here's one thing with the counters, looking at them. Just to jump to something completely random. It's really hard to tell the different counters apart. In fact, punching the game, the only way I could tell is the backs. The Austrians are gray, the Prussians have a blue on them. That's not, of course, specified in the rules. Nothing is. The only thing that is indicated is these little symbols in the middle there, which I find virtually illegible in terms of what they might mean or whatever. Okay. So anyway, it ends up being really a close run fight, and here Frederick learns that the Austrians are not going to be the pushover that they were back in the War of Austrian Succession. Massive back and forth fighting, big cavalry duel up here. And that's one of the things that I like about this era, although I'm not sure I'm competent at it, is you've got probably the best mix of arms of any era. Sure, Napoleonic era has power to all three arms still. I mean, you need infantry, you need cavalry, you need artillery in the Napoleonic. But artillery's gotten so powerful that it almost dominates the field in the Napoleonic era. Here, all the different arms seem almost equal. It's just it's a very intriguing period for that particular reason. And I'm kind of interested to see how it works out. So, for example, the cav goes up, it threatens infantry, infantry turns into a square. You need that for the artillery to be effective, and the artillery can start bombing the square. But here, because Friedrich is being channeled into such a tight little area with such a large force, and he wants to move fast, he's going to have tight formation, which presumably should make him more vulnerable to the artillery that's on the board for the Austrians. Austrian artillery is slightly advantaged. There was something else I wanted to say real quick, because I'm about up. And damned if I can remember. Okay. We got skirmishers, these light grenzers, and These are grenadiers. The Austrian grenadiers operate as skirmishers. The Prussians have no skirmishers. Whatever tiny amounts they had would have been used not as independent units. Well, this has been a hard one, both to read and convince myself to start. It may be very hard for me to play through it. I'm going to try my best because I've made a big investment in these games, but I really don't know. I can see this is going to be very, very painful. And I don't know. All right, up it goes.